This week, Trump took a shot at the Western financial system as we know it that could impact Canada, America, and the rest of the world for decades to come. And at the same time, Canada could head down a similarly frightening path, as Canada's most important banker gave a very revealing speech in Mexico City. Now, at first, this might sound complex or like it doesn't impact you, but trust me, this will impact every single person, their money, and their investments. Plus, we'll go over how you can protect yourself moving forward. You might have already heard about how Trump is firing Lisa Cook, one of the members of the committee who makes incredibly important economic decisions for America. Now, Trump has said this firing is a result of mortgage fraud evidence that they've found, and that will play out as time goes on. But the general consensus is that this is more of a political move, giving Trump effective control over the Federal Reserve, allowing him to lower interest rates, which in turn could help the American economy's numbers ahead of midterm elections. This is a far bigger deal than most people believe. Since the 1950s, central banks have made the claim that they are and should be independent of the government. They should be able to do what they do. The government shouldn't have a say. This is something that the current liberal world order views as incredibly important, a foundational rule that is good for the economy, though there is some reasonable skepticism there, and we'll get to that soon enough. It's true, central banks like the Federal Reserve or the Bank of Canada are incredibly important, and you feel the impact of their decisions on your life every single day, even if you don't realize it. And they have a couple different responsibilities that come to mind. The first one is setting interest rates. They impact interest rates that flow through the economy, impact whether or not you can get a mortgage and how expensive that mortgage will be, among other things. They are also the lender of last resort. In other words, they lend the government money when nobody else will by printing money. We saw a lot of this during COVID, but we also see it during the great financial crisis. Some economists believe that only bad can come from the government taking control over monetary policy or the policy that impacts our money. They use Turkey as an example, saying that, hey, when other leaders have taken control of central banks, well, they've tended to want to go for low interest rates to make their economy look better. And as a result, we see incredibly high resulting inflation. To make this point even clearer, recently the governor of the Bank of Canada gave a speech in Mexico City at Mexico's central bank, and he made this point. He said, hard choices and uncertainty increase the risk of public disappointment, frustration, and criticism. That's why it's important for central banks to remain independent from the political process. In other words, he's saying, well, sometimes the Bank of Canada or any central bank is going to have to make decisions that are not popular in the eyes of the current politicians who are in power, but we need to be independent so we can continue to make those decisions that are best for the economy. But there is a legitimate argument that while this independence may be good for the economy, it isn't actually best for people. Now, bear with me here. I'm not making the argument that Trump is in the right here. We'll get into why I'm actually afraid of what's going on. But I will make the argument that this idea that independence, that many see as some sort of hallowed or holy, untouchable right, how it's also part of the cause of the biggest issues we face in our time as a country and globally, such as the incredibly unaffordable housing, the cost of living we're dealing with, and how the quality of life for people like you and me and average people all around the world has dropped so incredibly noticeably in the past decade. I'll reemphasize, the Bank of Canada said that's why it's important for central banks to remain independent from the political process. But while he says they're independent from the political process, which is true and could prevent them from being influenced by presidents or prime ministers, what is also true is that this means independence from democracy, independence from accountability to what ultimately should be served, which in my opinion is real people. Let me make my point by telling you a story of what, from a high level, went incredibly wrong during the pandemic and the following years. Let's look at it from the perspective of one central bank, the Bank of Canada. I already told you about how central banks have a role as interest rate setters, but I also mentioned their role as a lender of last resort. In other words, when the government can't get anyone else to lend the money, well, central banks will step in, and that happened during the pandemic when the government of Canada needed to, in their eyes, this could be debated, but in their eyes needed to spend incredible amounts of money to support people and businesses throughout the pandemic. Well, they weren't going to be able to borrow that money from their traditional lenders. Instead, they, through a number of different programs, borrowed this directly from the Bank of Canada, who printed hundreds of billions of dollars to give to them. You can see it as this chart goes up. This represents the Bank of Canada printing tens of billions of dollars per week and using that to buy Government of Canada debt, essentially funding the government during this period of incredibly high spending. Now, there's no doubt that these actions did save aspects of the economy and our GDP, but it came at an extreme cost for normal people. Nearly 400 billion new Canadian dollars were printed to stimulate the economy and to finance the government's massive COVID programs, both through artificially low interest rates and via this $400 billion trickling into the economy. The value of each individual dollar, well, that went down, as well as the demand for goods and services going up. With more dollars in the system and with more demand for goods and services, we, of course, saw incredibly high consumer price inflation. The cost of living went up, peaking at 1.8% year over year in June of 2022. With hundreds of billions of dollars flooding into the system and incredibly low interest rates, of course, the prices of Canadian houses went up as well, making even worse an already extreme housing crisis. Along this same timeline, we also saw stock prices go up globally, emphasized here by the American companies in the S&P 500. Now, this is not as largely due to the Bank of Canada, but to the Fed, the American central bank, who implemented a very similar policy at a similar time, as did all of the central banks worldwide. It seemed kind of coordinated. And I wonder if you can notice any similarities between the timelines and the shapes of these charts. The Bank of Canada printing billions of dollars at the same time that the Fed was, alongside average Canadian housing prices and Canadian inflation and the value of various different companies and their stock prices. They all follow a similar path. I wonder why. And many politicians and central bankers pointed to these charts and said, look, this indicates a strong economy. Our GDP is up. Our house prices are up. Stocks are up. It's fantastic if you have a stake in the system, if you have equity in companies, if you own assets like most of the world's wealthy do. Now, on the flip side, however, the most vulnerable people, paycheck to paycheck people who are just making ends meet, don't have the extra funds to invest in assets. Well, they get screwed. All that they experience, they don't get the house price going up of the one that they already own. They don't see the value of their investments going up. They don't have investments. All they see is the inflation side. Rent gets higher, groceries get higher, and they start to think, well, what's going on here? And if you have any problem with this, sorry, there's no way to impact how this type of policy is handled. Central bankers who run these operations aren't accountable to politicians. And that can be good in some ways, but it also means that they're not accountable to any type of democratic process. They're untethered from a meaningful responsibility to look out for the interests of all people, not just the people who are already wealthy and benefit from the status quo remaining as it is. And central bankers will act like they hear this and understand. They say, but we can't hide behind our independence. We need to draw on a diversity of views, and we need to be transparent and accountable in everything we do. Okay. But it seems like this talk of transparency and accountability is merely lip service. All throughout the rest of the speech, the governor of the Bank of Canada talks about how the inflation we saw had nothing to do with the actions of any central bank. He says, as the economy reopened, inflation did rise sharply, hitting 8.1%, a 40-year high. Not good. But to be clear, this was not a failure of our framework. It was a result of Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. This was unforeseeable, and we misjudged the strength and persistence of inflation in 2021 and 2022 as a result of matters that were out of our control. It was the result of supply shocks and the invasion of Ukraine, not anything we had to do with. Now, you can see I'm getting kind of passionate about this, but I'd be a lot more docile in the way that I talk about central banks if they did take any accountability for the real harm that they caused many people worldwide. If they came out and said, hey, you know what? We did this monetary policy. We printed this money. It kept a lot of businesses open. It kept the economy running, but we recognize that did hurt people, and here's how we're going to change things in the future so that it doesn't happen. That's accountability. That's explaining how we made a mistake and how we're going to make sure it doesn't happen in the future. But they don't do that. They don't promise that it's not going to happen again. But back to the Trump headline, the news of the day, the firing of a Federal Reserve committee member. Now, I said I wasn't making an argument in favor of Trump's actions. I also said earlier that the problem is a lack of accountability for actions within central banks and how they're not just independent from politicians, but as a result also are independent from any kind of dramatic process or accountability, which is true. There's no guarantee that if you took this monetary power out of the hands of these technocratic elite central bankers, that any individual politician would do a better job. That's not clear. It's a nuanced problem. Central banks under the control of politicians, though, would at least have the appearance of accountability since politicians are elected by people. But at the same time, the urge to think in the interests of getting reelected and not in the interests of everyday people could prove all too tempting for any politician who has this power. Now, I've already said this is what I think Trump will do as a result of this firing, lower interest rates so that he can boost the economy ahead of the upcoming midterms before any potential side effects, i.e. inflation, would be felt by the public as a result of those rate cuts. Now, despite not having a clear solution to all of this, to me, something is clearly wrong when an unelected cohort of elite worldwide bankers who have so much incredible control over the day-to-day lives of average people, they have no mechanism to ensure that those elite people do right by the people they're supposed to be serving, just average citizens. So there's a fight going on in America about this independence. Where does Canada stand? Well, to me, it's very clear that Mark Carney, Canada's newest prime minister, is incredibly in favor of central bank independence. After all, his first extremely prominent job was as the governor of the Bank of Canada, the double or triple predecessor to the person who gave that speech in Mexico City. He then went on to be the Bank of England central bank governor. Obviously, this is the cohort, this is the class of people he comes from. To me, he's an emblem of this system, an emblem of the status quo and the protection of the financial interests of the already wealthy. This is something I talked about as my primary concern about him being prime minister, is that for young people or people who are seeking some sort of change to the system, this guy is emblematic of the way things have been and these elite people who are able to make major decisions that impact our lives. On the flip side, the leader of the opposition in Canada, Pierre Poilievre, has repeatedly claimed that central banks should be held accountable, though even he doesn't have many real good solutions here.
It was one of Pierre Poilievre's first promises while campaigning to be Conservative leader.
I've already announced that I will fire the governor of the central bank to get inflation under control.
A crusade against Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem, who Poilievre continually blamed for high inflation, including once he became Conservative leader, where he took his attacks to another level in this interview with Prime Asia Television.
So do Canadians have a right to sue back?
They don't, but they should. That's a good point. You should be allowed to sue the Bank of Canada for the fact that it has destroyed so many people's livelihoods and households.
But Friday, Poilievre wouldn't repeat those same promises.
Do you still intend to fire the Bank of Canada governor?
Well, listen, my view is that when governments drive up inflation, the people who are responsible should be held accountable.
As part of this argument, he says that the Bank of Canada was really not independent from the government in the first place because of the way that their money printing coincided with the pandemic spending, which otherwise would not have been possible from Trudeau's government, despite the fact that this policy led inflation upwards and away from the 2% target that the Bank of Canada is mandated to maintain independently. He says that the government or the governor should be fired as a result, but if that happened, it would have been him firing the governor, meaning the bank would not be independent, which was part of Poilievre's concern in the first place. I think you can probably see how this quickly gets pretty complex. I think it's wrong that there's no accountability for how central bank money printing and other policies have negatively impacted average people while helping the rich, driving the wealth gap wider. But at the same time, I don't see a simple solution for making this type of power accountable without just shifting that power to short-term oriented politicians. Perhaps this type of power shouldn't even exist in the first place. Like in The Lord of the Rings, the goal wasn't to bring this ultimately powerful ring to Galadriel, a good guy. They would be able to handle it and not be corrupted. It was to throw it into Mount Doom and destroy the power forever. But eliminating central banking is a problem that opens up a whole other can of worms, and I honestly don't think it's very likely to happen. If you're like me, it can leave you feeling pretty powerless and wondering, okay, what can I do to protect myself from these types of actions, which will likely happen again? Now, I think that the system's unlikely to change very much. And if you agree with me, then you need to just grab onto the system as best you can and go for the ride, become a part of it, even if you recognize that that system seems to be quite unfair. It may sound easier said than done, but you need to do everything you possibly can to save as much additional money. But don't just sit on it in your bank account. You need to invest that into assets, things that go up in value when there's this funny business from central banks, things that I showed you, the S&P 500 going up, any kind of equities for the most part were helped in that situation, alongside real assets like real estate or gold and silver. These things tend to do well when there is money printing and when the value of dollars are debased. At the very least, the value of the investment or the purchasing power behind that investment doesn't go down as the dollar's value erodes. I wish I had some grand idea for a revolution that could make everything better and would make it so that we don't have this system that disproportionately favors the already wealthy while casting the poor to the side and driving that gap even farther and farther apart. That's the system that we have, and I don't see any easy solution or a likely way that we're going to get out of it. So like I said, all you can do is grab on and try to prepare yourself and your family as best you can, even if it's as a part of a system you don't agree with. But I'm curious what you have to say about all of this. What do you think of Trump trying to fire the Federal Reserve governor? And what do you think of the impact that that has on the idea of central bank independence? Is that a concept that is getting weaker and weaker here? Do you have any solutions that maybe I'm not thinking of? I'm trying to figure things out just like anybody else. I'm curious what you think I've missed, what I've gotten right, what I've gotten wrong. Let me know in the comments and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. But with all that said, thanks so much for watching, everybody. I really hope this video helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.